we're going to shift gears real quick because we do need to talk about something, and it is about segregation. So Trump ended the ban on segregation in government contracts. You heard that right. Now, segregation is illegal because of the Civil Rights Act, 1964. But there was a specific thing in the federal government that said any federal facility or any type of contractor that gets federal funds, there can be no segregation. But now Trump removed that limitation. This is crazy, dude. Segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts. This is something new. Now, I told you guys very early on that the ultimate goal of Christopher Rufo, the Manhattan Institute, the Heritage Foundation, their attacks on CRT, it was CRT, then woke, then DEI. What this is, what they have been after, which is something that evangelicals have been after since the 70s, is they want to return to segregation. They never wanted segregation to end. The Southern Baptist Conference was so pro-segregation, it was their huge battle. And then, in fact, Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education to make sure they couldn't resegregate schools. That's why he created it. Eventually, they realized they weren't going to go back on it, so they started fighting against abortion, which they used to not have a problem with, but abortion became their new fight. But now they are back on the segregation, and they've been using the DEI and the CRT and the anti-woke sentiment to try to demonize, like they've lumped the gay and the trans and the racial stuff into one, umbrella of equity and inclusion. But ultimately, they do want segregation back. They want to be able to have white schools in the South. Okay, they want to force the people of color into black schools. Now, once they get rid of the Department of Education, they're going to be able to stamp out gay kids and black kids and whomever else to create their white schools, and the federal government will no longer be able to fight them. So after a recent change by the Trump admin, the federal government no longer explicitly prohibits contractors from having segregated restaurants, waiting rooms, and drinking fountains. The segregation clause is one of several identified in a public memo issued by GSA last month, affecting all civil federal agencies. The memo explains that it is making changes prompted by Trump's executive order on DEI, which repealed an executive order signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. That was the year after the Civil Rights Act, regarding federal contractors and non-discrimination. The memo also addresses his executive order on gender identity. While there are still state and federal laws that outlaw segregation and discrimination that companies need to comply with, legal experts say this change to contracts across federal government is significant. It's symbolic, but it's incredibly meaningful in its symbolism. And this is exactly it. This is very important. It is very symbolic because here's what it is saying. They said there are still state and federal laws that outlaw segregation and discrimination, which is a fact. But guys, who enforces the state and federal laws on discrimination if those officials don't enforce them? The federal government does. Alabama, there's federal laws about segregation, but if the state of Alabama breaks the federal laws, it is the federal government that would enforce the federal law. So, by them removing the federal language about segregation, they are saying the federal government no longer specifically targets segregation in the federal facilities and contractors thereof. So therefore, if you start breaking that law, guess what? We're probably not going to come and punish you either. Okay, that's what it really does. If Alabama segregates, Trump ain't going to fucking prosecute him, is what's going on. These provisions that required federal contractors to adhere to and comply with federal civil rights laws and to maintain integrated rather than segregated workplaces were all part of the federal government's efforts to facilitate the settlement that led to integration in the 50s and 60s. The fact that they are now excluding those provisions from requirements for federal contractors speaks volumes. It does indeed. It is a message from on high that says, guess what? We ain't prosecuting. The clause in question is in the Federal Acquisition Regulation known as FAR, a huge document used by agencies to write contracts for anyone providing goods or services to the federal government. The clause about prohibition of segregated facilities reads, the contractor agrees that it does not and will not maintain or provide for its employees any segregated facilities at any of its establishments, and that it does not and will not permit its employees to perform their services at any location under its control where segregated facilities are maintained. Now, here's what's important. Another thing about this with the federal contracts is this now allows them to have federal contracts with other countries that are segregated, where there's no state or federal law, like Elon's home country of South Africa, for example. They can have segregated companies from South Africa or a cobalt mine in the Congo. Elon can run a cobalt mine in the Congo that is segregated, and he can now get a government contract because there isn't a law against segregation over there. You see that other impact? That's a fucking important thing. It defines segregated facilities as work areas, restaurants, drinking fountains, transportation, housing, and more. And it says you can't segregate based on, race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. So now Elon can segregate overseas factories and still get government contracts. Dude, this is crazy. One federal worker who works on contracts says they were shocked when they received the notice. NPR has agreed not to identify the worker because, they don't want to end up on a plane to El Salvador. And so they said normally there is a public notice or comment period for 45 to 90 days, but they're not. This went into effect immediately. So there you go. So now you can segregate based on race or sex or gender identity or what have you, and you can still get a government contract. Dude, that shit is nuts. And yes, I imagine for black people, like he said, I learned about this earlier today, but I had to compose myself before posting because this breaks a part of my soul. It's a return to the 50s. There he is. They're bringing it back, guys. This is horrifying. And again, though, this is what MAGA voted for. They voted for this. This is what they want, guys. This is what they want. This is what they've always wanted. When they say make America great again, they're talking about the 50s. They're talking about the 40s. Trump is talking about the 1890s. That was like the thick of Jim Crow, during the Reconstruction. Vagrancy laws, slave patrols, now calling themselves police, black codes, convict leasing, right? If you don't have any money, you're too poor, we're putting you in jail. We're going to release you back to the plantation you got freed from. It's fucking unbelievable, dude. Or it's totally believable. What is up, guys? Thank you so much for watching. You like the video, you want to support independent resistance media, you know what to do. Drop that sub, hit the like button, and please share it. And we do love our members, so if you want to become a member, it's another really great way to support. Thanks again for everything, guys. I'll see you next time. Let's go.